of the InfoSec Summit. Whether your heart needed it or not, certainly hope you joined us for a full breakfast in the next door. And again, thanks to Connie and her minions for putting together a very, very well-run show. I'd like to take a moment and thank some of our sister organizations for not only attending, but for their support throughout the year. So, of course, that would be ISACA, ISC Squared, OWASP, and InfraGard. We're going to kick off the show this morning with a very respected security leader who's driven a bit to join us. And wanted to talk a bit, before that happens, about one of our sponsors who's really helped us out for, 5 years running? And most of you probably do know who Solutionary is in the managed security services space, but if you don't, you should definitely know Dave Golding from Pittsburgh. We see his face in town from time to time, and we are very, very fortunate to have had your support for the past 5 years. We couldn't do many things that we do, certainly with the very low price points and the quality of the programs, if it weren't for you and other sponsors. So, Dave, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave. Again, my name's Dave Golding. I'm an area sales director with Solutionary, and it's a real pleasure to be here. As Dave said, we've been a supporter of the organization for years, and that's really because it's such a well-run organization. You know, we have an opportunity. I cover 4 states for Solutionary, and I have an opportunity to, I have a certain amount of money that I can spend, and it's never enough to sponsor all of these types of events. So we choose this event because it is so well run and so well attended. So thank you for being here this morning. You're here bright and early, and I'm sure Susan is going to do a great job of talking to you and helping to educate you and further your experience and knowledge of the industry. Just a quick commercial about Solutionary. If you're not familiar with us, we are a managed security services provider. Been in business for about 16 years. We're a global company now. We were purchased by NTT about 2 years ago. We have 2 security operations centers here in the United States, one in Omaha where we were founded and is our North American headquarters, and then another one in Pittsburgh where Susan and I are both from. So we really serve 2 primary areas. One is in monitoring our customers' networks, so taking log feeds from devices, and we have analysts and engineers 24/7 by 365 looking at those logs and responding to alerts that are actionable and then escalating that to our customers. The other area is in professional services. So we do a lot of assessment work, threat intelligence, incident response, really, coming alongside our customers and walking shoulder to shoulder with you through, your daily lives of, trying to keep the bad guys at bay. So appreciate you guys being here, and want to introduce Susan. She is, we're really lucky to have her here with her experience and knowledge. Currently, she's at Aetna. She's been there about 4 weeks, so she's off to a new adventure. She's the Chief Data Protection Officer at Aetna. She has 17 years in risk management and InfoSec, primarily in the financial services industry at Bank of New York Mellon and Synovus, where she was the CISO. She has built programs for security operations, risk assessment, and business continuity, and she holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Pittsburgh, and she has an MBA from Duquesne University. So with that, I will give you Susan Koski.
Bring your slides up.
Well, good morning, everybody. Morning. Well, I'm not going to make you do yoga poses. So while we're bringing that up, I just want to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk about rebuilding and transforming information security function. This, from a disclaimer perspective, thank you. This does not reflect my current role at Aetna. As we have indicated, I've only been there 4 weeks. It's an incredible opportunity to join the healthcare space, though, given, I spent so much time in financial services. But, just to give you a perspective of an assessment of something that I inherited and then, had to transform and rebuild. couple key things. So perception. Organization was an organization of no. They wouldn't really help the business, and the business, was really going around the organization. Thought very much of a technology organization, not thought of as an organization that was business focused or risk based. Very much a compliance check the box level, low trust. So we weren't really sought out for expertise. We weren't really seen as an organization that was a trusted advisor, somebody who the business would reach out to, somebody who the technology organization would reach out to. And from a talent perspective, that there was some good talent, but there was also opportunity to change out some talent. Market was very competitive even back then. And in addition to that, it was a market where it was difficult to attract people to move to. And there really hadn't been a focus on looking outside that market and leveraging other locations where we actually were located and leveraging talent in those. For example, we're very close to Atlanta, but it really hadn't tapped into the Atlanta market. Atlanta market's big, but we hadn't tapped into that and leveraged people in that particular market. Regulatory. You may find yourself in that situation. I've got to move this. All right, let me have because this is
It could drive you nuts.
it's really making a lot of noise. Okay. So being sorry, guys. There we go. So in the Atlanta market, there's a lot of opportunity in that particular market. We weren't really taking advantage of that and having people located in office space that we already had. And, from a regulatory scrutiny perspective, you might walk into a situation where all of a sudden, you're handed, hey, by the way, the regulators have come to us and said, you need to fix these things and you need to fix them quickly. And then you might also find yourself in a situation where you walk in, you have a lot of SOX issues and you've got to quickly address those. And then from a technology and process perspective, what do you have that's foundational? Do you have the foundations? Do you have the basic, blocking and tackling? When you look at the Verizon data breach report, a lot of the things that they investigate are still from the basics. Now, granted, there's a lot more sophistication nowadays, but it's still a lot from the basics. And then funding. In financial services, there's a lot of focus on efficiency. There is still incremental funding with the recognition of how serious the events are that are happening in the world today. But the funding really, whether you're in financial services or I think any market, the funding needs to be laser focused. You need to have a message. You need to explain what you're doing with that money. If a business gets an investment to build a new asset management product, to do a new customer-facing product, they're showing ROI, they're showing benefit. I think from a business perspective, people expect that same thing of us, but we've tended to be very focused on the technology and the whiz-bangy tools. One of the things I told my folks, because they would say, well, we're going to go talk to the business about encryption. And I said, that's great if you want them to glaze over like a donut. I said, they really, you need to talk to them in business terms that they can understand to get your message across. And I think that's part of the challenge we face as a group. So I want to talk a little bit about something that I call evangelism infusion. So I'm going to take a little pause before I go into talent management. This is about how you market and how you sell. At the end of the day, you are a teacher. You are there to teach the organization about information security, about why it's important. But you need to teach it in terms that folks can understand. Examples, analogies, stories. You've got to change. So what I did is I used that to change the perception of the organization. Now, there was a lot of underpinning foundational building blocks that we put in place, but you needed to start having the conversation. So we reached out to our senior executives. I got on their calendar quarterly or monthly if they wanted that. But I talked to them about the industry landscape, things that were changing regulatory-wise, things that what we were doing to help the business, what it meant to them, and what it meant in potential dollars and cents. What I asked of my leadership team was the same thing. Number one, it helped them with their communication skills and how they communicated to the business. So I asked each of them to pick someone at my peer level to meet with quarterly. They had to do 2. And what they did was create a relationship. And in creating that relationship, they would meet with those folks quarterly and have a fireside chat. We didn't PowerPoint people to death. We talked about what we're doing. We talked about it in simple terms. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about security awareness. And one of those relationships we created with communications and marketing just really paid off probably 100-fold for us, because they actually helped do the work. It was a situation, it took about a year and a half, but we really had people wanting to help us and do things for us. And we're a small team, so any help we could get was wonderful. And then the other thing that we also did was enable our staff to have the conversation and have the message. It's not just about the leadership team, but it's also about your high potential folks and your staff having the conversation, so that as they grow, whether they're going to grow into a technical leadership path or a managerial leadership path, they have the skills to do those same things. I'm going to switch to talking about talent a little bit. So, a situation I ran into was we really didn't have a great recruiting program. So really figuring out what universities were the target, partnering with HR, and going out and explaining why this is a cool place to work. A lot of folks coming out of college look at banking and look at other things, and it's not Google, it's not Silicon Valley, and it's not cool and attractive to them. Well, there are some really interesting and cool things that you can do analytic-wise in financial services, from a TAC perspective in financial services. And you've got to make that kind of interesting to the students and reach out to them. You also need to understand, what is your opportunity? Can you use external recruiters? Do you want to do fee-based? Do you want to do retained search? My preference at the staff level position is really around a fee-based, because if you do a retained search, you pay that money up front. Not that there's anything wrong with that, so if anybody does retained search in the room, but depending upon the level, that can be, you put the money out and it might take you a long time to find that person. From a seasoned talent perspective, you also need to have those people, give them a path forward. So one of the things that we were working on when I left was really job descriptions that would allow people to be a principal from a technology perspective. And these may be folks that are never going to be managers, but they are technically gifted and competent and are just bright stars that you want to make sure they have a growth path. If there's engineer 1, 2, and 3, and then they're stuck, that might be someone who might want to leave the organization, and you don't want to lose people you invested in. And these folks, too, give them the opportunity to present to executive management. Let them learn. I had a gentleman on the team that was incredibly brilliant from a technology perspective, had trouble translating and communicating at different levels. So how do you learn? You got to do it. But we gave him the opportunity to do that in a friendly learning environment. We first did that with a team. And so I also had a business continuity team as well as our check fraud channel and anti-money laundering. So I made him present to those other groups that didn't know about technology, which enabled him to then go start being able to speak more to the business. So figure out how you enable your seasoned talent as well. It's not all about external training, although that is very important. And then on new talent, think outside the box. You might get an English major, a psychology major. When you talk about security awareness, folks that understand psychology and human behavior and changing human behavior are really important from a security awareness perspective. Had a young lady that worked on our risk control governance team, English major. She was probably one of the brightest people and most passionate people for learning. And I think that's a key factor. Find someone who has the passion. You can train people. I can't train passion, but I can train you if you have the passion. She got to a point where she actually was running our annual GLBA compliance assessment and our PCI reviews. English major. And, really passion, desire to learn, and would really learn like a sponge. From a regulatory perspective, in financial services, there's, a ton of scrutiny, and there has been for years. But one of the things I found is we needed repeatable processes. So what are the issues? How are we responding to them? Folks would tend to give us a paragraph or two of the status for an issue, and teaching people program management incremental milestones so that you know you're not going to miss a target date. What I initially found was folks were missing target dates, but we didn't know why. We weren't pre-warned, ahead of time. So there was rigor put in place so that executives would sign off if target dates were missed, and there was a repeatable process for those particular updates. In addition to that, from a regulatory perspective, you need to understand what are you facing? What are you going into? Do you have a lot of regulatory findings from your external regulators in financial services, FDIC, OCC, FRB, SEC? I'm probably missing one. But what issues currently exist? Do you have a good relationship with them? What business lines are primarily targeted to those? There may be some cases where the OCC is the primary for a certain business line, but on the IT side, you've got the FDIC or the FRB. So you need to understand that, but you also need to understand if you're a publicly traded firm externally, do you have SOX problems? I also walked into a situation where we had some SOX opportunities, I'll call them, and really figuring out how do we kind of get our arms around those and address those quickly. And then last, but definitely not least, is your internal auditors. They can be your best friends. Sometimes people cringe at the internal auditors, but they can be your best friends. Go into the relationship point. You need to have relationships with your auditors, with your external auditors, your regulators, as well as your internal auditors. You need to be at a point with your external auditors and your regulators where you can pick up the phone and ask them a question. They do know things, they are connected, and you need to leverage those particular resources so that you know what their expectations are and they know what that they're going to expect from you. I found it also helpful to give them regular briefings. So they weren't coming in once a year and seeing, okay, this is how things work. That we were really putting people in front of them, explaining the projects that we have, explaining the business projects that we have, what we're supporting really across the O&T environment, operations and technology environment, and helping folks understand what we are delivering. And what you saw happen is, maybe that something wasn't as close of a relationship as it could be, or maybe a little more, I don't want to say adversarial, but not as comfortable, became more comfortable and more open dialogue. And the regulators still have to have their independence, but you need to have that good relationship with them. So from a strategic planning perspective, and you've got to measure yourself. What is your plan? What are the gaps? So get some industry frameworks, pick one, pick two. I've done ISO and then the NIST cybersecurity framework. I think there's a lot of talk in the industry, will the NIST cybersecurity framework become the de facto litigious standard? Possibly. There's a lot of, discussion around that. I think once we start seeing some cases and some case law, it'll be interesting to see if folks are held to that particular standard, and then, how do you know how you measure up? But know where you are, and then help use that to help build your business case for what you need to do. But in building that business case, on a slide previous, I talked about talent. Your talent needs to be out in the industry. They need to have industry connections. Forums like this. If you don't know the person next to you, say hi. Meet the people next to you. Understand who they are. They can be great sources of information as you proceed in your career. Know people in your industry. If you're a member of an ISAC, get to know people. Go to those conferences. They can be very helpful in understanding the industry perspective. Questions I would always get from executives is, what is everyone else doing? What do we look like compared to everyone else? You need to understand that bar and where you are. So measure yourself to those industry frameworks, and then define guiding principles. Define something that's very simple. I use 3. People can usually remember 3 things. We have a red, yellow, green stoplight. So I used something that was very simple that was part of telling the story. I talked about those liaison programs with my leadership team. These were the messages they were enabled with. It was something simple, something repeatable. All the funding was tagged to it. All the program management reviews were tagged to it. And really tie all of those particular guiding principles to your evangelism program. When you're going out and meeting with your executives, explain how those things map. Explain that scorecard. Explain how you're kind of rating yourself. Talking a little bit about key programs to meet those principles. So we had some key programs, and they had great technology awareness. When presenting to the board, which I often had to do monthly, need to put that in terms the board can understand. You know, often your board, some of them may have a technology background, some of them may not, but it's not that you can't expect them to be an expert in your area. That's what they're paying you for. So as part of that, really making, so for example, let's say you needed to rebuild your security operations. So you could say, I need to do a SOC. Okay, well, what if you use a term, I need to expand our real-time monitoring? That plays a little different. People understand that a little bit better. So think of the terms that you would leverage for your board and then for your business. Use a roadshow as part of, maybe even planning for your board presentation. Progress. I think this is key. A lot of us have grown up in technology, not all of us, but we're not the best at marketing. And program management is about what is management and the board getting for their money. So they gave you money. What did you do with it? What value did you add? And if you don't have program management, whether you build that internally yourself or you leverage it from a PMO organization or your IT organization, you've got to market what you're doing, but you've got to show progress. Show your progress back to your guiding principles. Show your progress back to that. Repeat, 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 because people will remember. I'm going to give you a little story. I was fighting might be a little strong of a word, but I was asking for capital. But asking for capital against all the business asks for capital. Use the 3 messages. Very simple. So there were a couple meetings where we had to present this. On the 3rd meeting, I went to the meeting, and our CEO looked at me and said, we understand your stuff. You don't need to go through it again. Why? The messages were simple. It was the same thing delivered over and over. It was 2 slides. We didn't make it overly complicated. People could understand it. And we got the funding. Now we did make some other, modifications to it, but we got what we needed because people understood it. It was something that didn't scare them. And last but not least, business projects. So you've got all your own projects to deal with, as Bill Sigline talked about yesterday, the war we're in. But you're also helping the business, right? How many of you consult with the business on a regular basis for a new business project, a new business portal? Show hands? Many of you folks in the room. But are you explaining to your executives what you're doing to deliver value to the business? I helped, if I'm going to use you as an example. So if you helped, get a new portal live or something like that, but it was secure, much cheaper to fix it early on than to have a problem and a breach and fix it later. I mean, the costs go up exponentially after something bad happens. Make sure you're delivering that message. When I would meet with the executive leadership team, 4 key things. 1, what's going on in the regulations? What's Congress talking about? What's the president issuing for sharing legislation, etc.? 2, what's going on in our industry? What are we saying about it? 3, what does our program look like? What are the key things we're seeing? What's the indicators? What's the threats we're looking at? In a numeric format. And 4, what are we delivering to the business? That was a consistent theme that we always went through. And I talk about evangelism. One of the things in measuring, I believe in measuring that success, is we started to get phone calls. And those phone calls were, can you help me? I have a question. When you get to that point and you're getting those phone calls, you've become that trusted advisor. You've changed the perception and you've transformed the organization to one that is at the table, to one that is being asked to be at the table. You're not having to put your foot in the door and get in the door. You're coming to the table. Little story, one of our business leads was really looking for a way to do some analytics to determine some of his business strategy. Needed to send data to a vendor. We all know vendors pose a risk. We all use them. They all probably have access to our environments. So he wanted to send data to a vendor, and it had come to my attention, and he wanted some help. And I said, well, what are you trying to send? And we looked through it, and I said, do you really need to send these fields? And he said, no. And I said, well, if we don't need to send that, the rest of this is really, it's not attributable to a person. And there weren't really any issues with that. So we found a way quickly to get that data to the vendor.
That guy became, I don't want to say my best friend, but a good friend. He would call on anything that he had a question on because we had helped him, because we took that particular time to help him. So I'm going to show you kind of example of the 3 guiding principles. Very simple. Foundation, detection, response. So when I came up with these, I thought, this really applies to information security, business continuity, and the fraud channel, and the financial fraud channel, and particularly the check payment channel, but it applied to others. You need to have a good foundation. You need to know, what am I looking for? What technology do I have in place? Do I have the basics? Do I have the right people? Do I have the right talent? Do you know what's going on in the environment, threat intelligence-wise? Are you adapting to that? Are you changing your foundation to deal with that? Are you regularly aware of what's changing? In the fraud space, those folks are smart. They know as soon as you change a threshold, if it's $500, they'll go to $499 to kind of slip under that. So you got to know and then continually look at that and make appropriate changes. And then on the talent side, you really need to find the right talent. This is probably one of the toughest markets. David Garcia and I were talking yesterday, and he said it's just an incredibly, incredibly hot market. But, look for unique methods. I talked about English majors, but you've also got to train the new folks. Leadership development programs, if your company has one, where you get interns in, or you get folks that after they graduate from college rotate through different areas and then maybe can join your organization. There's some things to think about. But I look for passion and fit with a team as one of my key factors. I ask the folks to do all the technical rounds first, and then I talk to people about right fit and where they can go in the organization. Because if it's not someone that's going to work as part of your team, they'll upset the apple cart, and then you won't have your team anymore. From a detection perspective, you need to continually monitor. I'm kind of a believer that we really can't prevent too many things. I think we can stop things, but I think the days of saying that you can prevent things are well over. From a detection perspective, continually monitor what you have. Automate as much as you can, if you can. You can't automate everything, but automate everything that you can, and then understand your risk. So information security, some organizations do it a little differently. Some of the larger organizations have an information security group and kind of a risk management team that does the control assessments, et cetera. But you have to know where your risks are. How good are your applications to meeting your standards? What do your vendors look like? Again, the vendors I think it's going to continue to stay and will be a hot topic. Just because a vendor provides you documentation that they do something well, do they? Do you know? Response. I think this is one of the most critical items. There were a couple talks yesterday about this, but you need to have an immediate response process in place. It's not just a technology issue. So when you look at, how some of the larger breaches have happened in the responses, Target had some missteps, and it really didn't look good for them. But I'm not trying to pick on Target there, so please don't take it that way. But trying to highlight the point there that you need to have an incident response plan. Legal needs to be there. Corporate communications, key business leaders, at some point maybe even your CEO, your chief risk officer, et cetera. All of those other functions and other support functions, as well as the business, need to be part of the plan. And that plan needs to be muscle memory. It cannot be, oh no, something happened, let's pull out the book. So you need to have tabletop exercises. If NIST has some great examples in one of their documents around incident response, and they have some great scenarios in the back. But plan those. We tabletop DDoS events, attacks against payment processors, and now in healthcare, I think it's the next new target. You had Anthem, and there was another recent one within the last week. So it needs to really be part of muscle memory, but you also need to have, how are you going to do it? Level 1, 2, 3 type of events. So I'm going to call it bronze, silver, gold. You need to have teams defined. And those teams, you need to have a team, and I call it the bronze team. There's your technical folks. They are trying to fix the problem. They are boots on the ground. But they are not the ones who need to necessarily, in my opinion, be sitting on the management calls giving management updates because it's taken away from their time to fix the problem. You need to have someone that is on that bronze team that then goes to what I call the silver level and gives that particular briefing to key leaders. Now, at the gold level, that is really your executive leadership, and it's the, hey, we know we're going to have a financial impact, we've got a reputation impact, an engagement there. And all these things need to be pre-staged and planned, but they need to be repeated, muscle memory. It needs to be something that people just pull out of a book and start executing, not something that, they're picking up, when the event particularly happens. And then ensure your risks have a treatment plan. So if you do assessments, make sure you're following up on the issues and realize we can't fix everything. What is really critical? What's critical to the business? What does it mean? Are you going to fix every low-risk issue? Probably not. But what's the most critical things you can have the business focus on? Because if you come at them with, hey, you got 50 things with this vendor, you need to help them prioritize and understand what's important. But make sure you have a taxonomy that's simple to understand. High, medium, and low might be a way to go, or align that with your enterprise risk management team if you have one in your company. They typically have something defined. In financial services, for market credit risk and operational risk, that was already defined. So we just tagged right to theirs. There was no need to invent our own. I'm going to talk a little bit about identity and access management. I think most of you guys know what this is. I'm not going to give a primer on that. But one of the things I found walking in was there was really no automation. We had, like I said, SOX opportunities. Certification processes were extremely cumbersome. I literally, I was like, okay, show me how it works. Because I like to roll up my sleeves and understand things so I can figure out how we fix them. And literally I had people in the business taping spreadsheets together. Like, they could probably fill up this table, taping spreadsheets together. So when we looked at how do we automate that and fix that, we picked the things that cause the most pain. My folks initially wanted to solve everything. I said, no. We're going to pick the top 5 things and we're going to address those. Turns out when we picked those, we saved each person in the business doing a certification 10 days a year. 10 business days a year to actually go out and do business things and make money. That's powerful. And that's a powerful message you want to take back. But those are the kind of things, as you look at projects, the kind of things you want to look at and take back. That's a powerful message. When you look at identity, what is your governance? You're not going to centralize everything unless that's the mandate, but you're probably going to have a mixed mode of centralized and decentralized. But how do you govern that? Do you have a steering committee? Do you have an advisory committee on the technical side? So you make sure that as new technologies are ingested into the environment, they fit the model. They fit the model for automated fulfillment. They fit the model for automated termination. They fit the model so that you're not trying to cobble together technologies that don't work well with each other. One of the key things I found was we had a lot of technologies, but not a lot of them leveraged a core directory. They had their own kind of intrinsic capabilities, or they couldn't consume a group from a directory. So we really started pushing that with the enterprise architecture team. And then we started looking at how do we enable things? How do we enable them quicker, faster, cheaper? On role-based, how do you make it simple? Where is your biggest bang for the buck? In banking, retail banking, we've got tellers, personal bankers on the front line. That access should be the same. A teller should not, a teller in bank A, B, C, and D and all the divisions should look similar. They didn't. That was addressed. But it was addressed in a way that was a partnership in working with the facilitators in the business units, really helping them understand why this is important, why we need to do it. It turned out some of those folks were dual-hatted. But they need 2 roles when they're dual-hatted, not one role adding all the other elements to that particular role. Needs to be consistent. What can you do for straight-through processing with RBAC? I don't believe everything is an RBAC opportunity. I believe some things are, and you find that low-hanging fruit and you address it. Every time we deployed something in identity, though, we waited a little bit for it to bake in, and then we surveyed. What did you like? What did you not like? How can we improve? Please give us feedback. One of the things that we also did in this particular space was, with the security facilitators, when I listened into the first meeting that we had, It was a lot about mainframe access and mainframe security controls, which is great. But those folks are all your people on the ground. If they tell one person and if you tell them and they tell one person and they tell 3 people, we brought interesting information to them about what's going on in the industry. And it was more of a, grassroots bottom up evangelism in that particular space too. And so we actually had people asking, well, what about this? Can you bring this to the floor? We want to hear about these things. Worked very well. Privileged users, I think, there was some great speeches yesterday about threat intelligence, but the privileged users, we know the bad guys are going after those folks. They're looking on LinkedIn to see who's a sysadmin at your company. You need to know who has that access, what they're doing with it, and what data they're touching. I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to access and data protection. Someone gave a great speech yesterday. There's no perimeter. There isn't. There's no perimeter anymore. There's too much ubiquity of, consumerization of IT. There's too much of that going on to think that we really have a perimeter anymore. That's been gone for a while, I would argue. I'm going to talk a little bit about security awareness. So, I talked about evangelism. I talked about the partnership with marketing and communications. Critical. Security awareness is not an event. It's not an annual thing that happens. It's a constant thing. I sat in on a security awareness presentation yesterday with Valerie Thomas and Harry Regan. I really like some of the messages that they had there. It's not an annual event. It needs to be creative. So a couple things, obviously we did the monthly newsletters and things like that, but we ran some contests. So whoever answered the questions first, and we did quizzes, gift from the company store. You'd be surprised how many people took that test and wanted that gift from the company store. People like to get stuff. Relationships. How can we come communicate and help you understand what's going on in the world? How can we do that? And we would reach out, and people would invite us to meetings, but we also leverage existing forums. So if your IT organization has a PMO forum and other groups already have forums, see if you can plug into that. You don't need to create all your own. See what else is out there you can plug into. And one of the other things too, I talked about that liaison and that partnership. For National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we really, I called myself the idea generator, and my staff made everything happen because they were awesome. But I said, you know what, I want to do videos. Our marketing and communications team wrote all the content, got our CEO to participate, and then they did something really creative. So we had a kickoff with the CEO, followed by the CISO, and then we had, for each one of the leadership team, we had our marketing folks created something really cool where they had someone in the field ask a question, and then they would fade out, and then they went to one of the team answering the question. And those videos really got a lot of uptake. But the other thing that we did on, usually an annual basis is we called it kind of our day. And what we did is we had demos of the things we did. We demoed certifications. We had someone talking about wireless security. And we actually, wasn't it really expensive? We popped popcorn, and, if any vendors wanted to donate and it was within our procurement policy, we would, give out those kinds of things. But what happened is, we had those days, we explained what we did, and people were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you guys did all those things. But again, more awareness. And, from year over year, that participation continued to increase with the day we had. We had a whole day dedicated to that. And then where do you take that on the road, or can you take that on the road? I mean, that's usually a time and effort kind of balance. But those kind of things with security awareness were wonderful, where we actually had people starting to ask really, really good questions, and really, really good questions at the executive level too. We ran our phishing campaigns, and, provided the metrics. And, one of the things, and I'm sure most of you have done this too, is when we ran our phishing, I always looked for who didn't take their test, and, let's focus on our executive management. Because the bad guys and girls are going to go after the executives. That's who they're going to target. So we made sure that the executives knew. And it was interesting too, because I knew that our executives really had gotten to that level of understanding when I started getting questions about, hey, we should do this to the board. And those kind of things where they were idea generators. So that's success. But it's a constant message, it's constant communication, and it's doing it in a way that people can understand. I'm going to talk a little bit about data. You got to know where your data is. You got to know what you're protecting. Are you always going to walk into a situation where that's perfect? No. But there's someone in your organization that is a database guru that can help you. There's someone in your organization can help you understand that. When we would do the annual GLBA controls, we had our centrally managed controls, but when we would go out and ask the businesses if they knew key things, we didn't ask them, do you do intrusion prevention and things like that? We asked them key things about where's your data, elements like that. And we found some opportunities to actually strengthen some of the controls in the business, but we also used that as a teaching moment. We tried to use a lot of things that we did as teaching moments, but to teach or explain things in terms people can understand. So instead of reading the data classification or information classification policy to folks, we would say, well, what do you see on your screen? What kind of data can you look at? Can you see this? Can you see that? And then we would say, well, that means this in the policy. And you'd see the light bulb. People go, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'm going to talk a little bit about vendor risk too. On vendor risk, you really need to be in partnership with your procurement team. Usually the security organization is an arm for the procurement team unless they do it themselves or have a third party do it. To assess how good a vendor's controls are for the information security risks. And, there's usually, other elements like business continuity and human risks or HR risks, but you need to know where those are. So you need to know how risky the vendors are. If a vendor's selling you pencils, maybe you don't really care about that one too much. But if a vendor is your third party and your outsourcer and they have all of your data, and if they have a breach, it's going to be a serious problem for you. Couple things. You need to be also in step with your legal department. You need to make sure that you know what the contractual clauses are that you're going to hold your vendors accountable to. Now, you may be in situations where some of those contracts are old or they're evergreen, that you're not going to change those overnight, but you need to have common contract language for what the vendors are, what you're going to expect of your vendors. How often are you going to audit them? What do you expect them to do with data once maybe you leave that relationship? How are they going to destroy it? There's a lot of things you want to consider when you're looking at your vendors. But you also need to talk with your procurement team and determine how inherently risky those vendors are. What's the criteria? Does that procurement team already have that information listed? And if they do, then plug into that. If not, come up with like 10 simple questions and start educating the business. We're asking you this so we can determine when you do site visits, invite the business to go with you. We had one business partner join us on one visit and really, had great feedback from the business partner, but it opens the business's eyes too, because they own the risk. And I think that's one of the key things we have, I think, made a lot of progress in that we don't own the business's risk. We help them identify it. If it's something that's too egregious, we might, get executive management involved to say, are you sure, you're sure, you're sure? But we really need to make sure that people understand the risks that they're doing with outsourcing and how that vendor is being held accountable and how they're being managed. And then if that vendor has a breach, how are you informed? Do they inform counsel so you can start privilege? How are you going to do that? I'm not going to go into detail about application risk, but it's a similar element about control risk assessments. I want to, in the essence of time, want to give a little attention to cyber threat management. So, this is the cool stuff. This is looking for the bad guys. But you need to know from an intelligence perspective, and what does that mean to your company? So what is going on out there? What feeds are you consuming? What industry groups are you plugged into? What connections do your threat intel people have? Do you have threat intel people? Are they dedicated? I think this area is just going to continue to grow. And do you have a way to assimilate all that data? So if you're using, let's say you have an outsourced SOC and you maybe have your level 1 function outsource. Well, that SOC, typically may have some threat intelligence folks even behind them. Where are you getting a feed of that information? Do they have it in a non-attributable format? Is there something you can leverage? When you look at, the ISACs, you can get feeds from them as well. And there's a lot of open source and free places to get feeds. So it's one thing to have data. It's another thing to make information about that. But then when your executives, as an example, hear about breaches, they're going to want to know what happened, how it happened, can it happen to us? So that person in threat intelligence should have good contacts with law enforcement. If not, get with your corporate security folks. They typically, came from law enforcement and can get you connected with the FBI, et cetera, but get connected. Sometimes you're not going to get everything you want out of those relationships because there's maybe things they can and can't share at that moment in time, but have those relationships so you can understand what that particular breach happened and what does that mean to you, because you were going to get that question from the board. Can that happen to us? What are we doing? Because the boards are going to be held more accountable. They can be named in class action lawsuits. They know it. And as part of your board education, you need to educate them on what they need to know. So you need to make sure if you can get that opportunity to educate your board. On the security operations, how does this tie into IT? How does this tie into incident response? At what DMARC do you have a level 1 incident, a level 2, and a oh no incident, which is at the level 3 level or whatever your model may be? Do you have the right people here that if you have a co-source model, so you're going to in-source, co-source, or completely outsource? If you're completely outsourcing, how are you measuring what the vendor's doing? How do you know they're meeting their SLAs? How do you know they're looking at the right things? If you potentially have a co-source arrangement, again, are they meeting key process indicators, SLAs? Are they identifying and finding what they had? Is it consistent? And if it's not consistent, why is that? Is that the right vendor? Do you have the right clauses in there? And I think in these particular areas, a lot of folks sometimes think of that as a vendor. It's a partnership. Those folks are basically almost like your employees. Someone else is just paying their paycheck. Those folks really need to be part and parcel of your environment and understand it to the extent that they can. You need to have that because they also need to have the context of what they're looking at, or they can't be as effective in their roles. Talking about penetration testing and red teaming, it's really critical to kind of know where your issues are. You may think you're great, but hire someone to tell you you're not and understand where your weaknesses are. Figure out how you're going to do that. Politically, you may want to start with something where people know that's happening, and then eventually you want to test that where people don't know what's happening. You want to see how the incident response works. And, software testing and technical consulting are other elements to consider here. I talked a little bit about the technical consulting already, but in the software testing, if you're developing a lot of your own, are you testing it? Do your developers know what to do? Your security team really should be a consultant organization there. Your developers should be armed with what they need to do, and that should be baked into their performance appraisals and their performance metrics on delivering good quality code. A software defect is a functional defect. It's not some sidebar thing that should be off to the side. It really needs to be included as part of the functionality. It is just another defect, but it can be a very critical defect if missed. And then on technical consulting, how do you know about the latest new things that your IT department might be looking at? How do you know if there's a risk? So how are you setting some of the requirements ahead of time? So you're part of good friction, not necessarily bad friction when those things come up. Because usually when those come up and the executives want the new thing, you got to be prepared to understand the risks of those new things and if that's something that your business wants to really assume. I want to leave a little time for questions. So those are some of the key things. Very passionate about this space. Love what I do. And hopefully we can continue to get better at winning the war. Contact information's up there. But if there's any questions, I'm happy to try to answer anyone's questions. Silent crowd. Yes, sir. So if y'all didn't hear the question, the gentleman asked, in all of this, where does a team of one begin? Well, I think you need to have, where I would start is around the policies and what the expectations are of the business. If you don't have written down what you expect, then they don't know what to follow. So, if you think about, you go take your driver's test, you have a book. You know what to follow, you know what to do, but make it simple, make it business friendly. Don't kind of hit people with, 1,000 pages of documentation. You can buy these things. They're, simple to buy, and pick a framework. My personal opinion is, I've seen cases where policies, include like every framework under the book. I think you pick one and then you can use something like the Unified Compliance Framework to show how it maps to all the other ones, because otherwise it's a maintenance nightmare for a person of one. I think too, if you leverage any vendors or third parties, someone mentioned yesterday, I think it was Bill in his keynote, vendors can be your friends. Have vendors come in and educate you, but have the vendors, and I would do a preview first. Have the vendors come in and educate your leadership team that you report to, or leaders at their peer level. Have some vendors do those things for you. Don't assume you have to do it all yourself. Vendors, they want to make sure that they can, get an opportunity to win your business. So see what opportunities you can give them to win your business, and understand if you've got a procurement department, are there already preferred vendors for like consulting or knowledge-based consulting, but leverage them. Did that answer your question? Yes, sir. So we really had to start with, I'd say more the qualitative side. And what we did is really report to the board on, so I'll pick vendor risk as an example. We reported to say, for our most critical vendors, are they baselined? Do we have the baseline done? Because that needed to be done. And then once we had that baseline done, we said we picked these based on their inherent risk. And again, 10 questions to the business. And then from a qualitative perspective, as far as, getting into calculation-wise, the next step in that is really around, so they're inherently risky, but you've done an assessment, you've gone on site, and the residual risk is really kind of low. I would say also tag to your enterprise risk management framework if you have one, because they usually have all that in place. You can use tools to kind of help you. If any of you are familiar with shared assessments, they have a SIG, a Standard Information Gathering Questionnaire, that will help you with all the questions you need to ask and auto-score those things. But, I think scoring is one element. And what is that, at the end of the day, what is that score telling me? I found doing kind of more of a scorecard to be a little more effective at that level. And is that within our risk tolerance or not? Any other questions? Because I know y'all want another coffee before the next meeting. Or tea. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you. Awesome group.